The last thing my son-in-law Mark said to me was, "Enjoy the homeless shelter. I've made sure you get nothing." He didn't say it on the rain-slicked steps of the courthouse where he'd later collapse. He said it in the hallway of the house I'd practically paid for 2 weeks after we buried my daughter. His face was a mask of polite concern, but his eyes were as cold and empty as a winter sky. That's the thing about true cruelty. It doesn't need to shout. It whispers. It began 6 months ago, in the suffocating quiet that follows a death. My daughter, my Claire, was gone, 42 years old. Cancer had devoured her, leaving behind a hollow space in the world that I kept walking into. To help pay for the treatments the NHS couldn't offer, the experimental drugs that bought us a few precious months, I'd sold my small terraced house. I moved in with her, Mark, and the children, becoming a live-in nurse, cook, and professional holder of hands. I watched the light fade from my baby's eyes, a pain so profound it felt physical, like a shard of glass lodged permanently in my chest. Mark had played the part of the grieving husband to perfection. I see that now. The tearful updates on Facebook that had friends calling him a saint. The way he'd hold Claire's hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles, but only when he knew a nurse was watching. Grief makes you stupid. It makes you blind to the man who is already mentally cataloguing his wife's jewelry while she's still breathing. The funeral was beautiful, all white roses and strained sunlight through stained glass. Mark's eulogy was a masterpiece of performative sorrow. He spoke of their eternal love, his voice cracking at all the right moments. I sat in the front pew, a grandchild's hand in each of mine, and felt nothing but a vast grey numbness. Sophie, at 16, was trying to be strong for her younger brother, Dan, but I felt the tremors running through her small frame. 2 weeks later, the performance ended. He knocked on my bedroom door at 7 in the morning. I thought he needed help with the school run. Instead, he stood there with a stack of flattened cardboard boxes. "Helen," he said. Not Mum, not the affectionate name he'd used for 15 years. Just Helen. "I need you to pack your things. The children and I need space. Your presence is making it harder for us to move on." The words didn't compute. I'd given up my home, my savings, my entire life to be here. I had nowhere else to go. Have you ever had the ground simply vanish from beneath your feet? It's a terrifying sensation. I tried to reason with him, suggesting he was still in shock. His laugh was sharp, like a breaking plate. "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in months," he'd said. "Claire's gone, and frankly, I don't need a constant reminder of her walking around my house. You look too much like her. It's depressing." That was the moment I knew. The moment I saw the monster my daughter had married. No man who had truly loved his wife could ever say something so vile about the mother who gave her life. No decent human being throws a grieving 67-year-old woman out onto the street. He told me the children understood, that it was what's best for the family. But they were at school. He hadn't even given me the dignity of saying goodbye. I packed 47 years of my life into 4 cardboard boxes and 2 suitcases. Photos, my late husband's watch, Claire's first pair of shoes. As I loaded them into my old Ford Fiesta, I saw him through the kitchen window. He was already on his phone, probably complaining to his mother about how difficult I'd been. That was 5 months ago. 5 months of living in a grim little bedsit above a kebab shop in Watford. The rent was cheap, a kindness from a landlord who saw the desperation in my eyes. I survived on my state pension and cheap tins of soup, the silence of my life broken only by the shouting from the street below. But the poverty wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the silence from my grandchildren. My calls went to voicemail. My texts, full of love and longing, were left unanswered. I just knew it was him. He was poisoning them against me, bricking up the walls between us until I was nothing but a bad memory. I drove to their school once, parking across the road, just to catch a glimpse, to see if they were all right. Sophie saw me. Our eyes met across the car park, and then she turned away, grabbing Dan's arm and pulling him quickly towards the school gates. That rejection was a physical blow. It hurt more than Mark's cruelty, more than the damp patch on my ceiling, more than the taste of cheap instant coffee, because it came from them. Or so I thought. There's a point you reach when you've lost everything, where you have a choice. You can lie down and let the world finish you off, or you can get up and you can start planning. In the quiet of that miserable little room, surrounded by the ghosts of my life, I decided I wasn't done fighting. My daughter didn't raise a quitter. And if you're listening to this and you've ever been pushed to that edge, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You find a strength you never knew you had. I didn't know how, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Mark Riley had made a terrible mistake. He thought he'd discarded a weak old woman. He had no idea he'd just created his worst enemy. And I was about to get my children back. The 5 months that followed were a masterclass in erasure. Have you ever felt yourself becoming invisible, fading from the world one day at a time? That was my reality. My days were a flat, grey loop of toast, tea, and the television murmuring in the corner. I'd walk to the local library just to be in a warm room with other human beings, pretending to read while the silence of my own life screamed in my ears. Each morning I would send the same text to Sophie and Dan. Thinking of you both, all my love, Grandma. And each morning the message would remain there, a stark blue bubble of hope against a white screen of indifference, marked only as delivered. I tried calling, but the calls rang out until voicemail kicked in, a cheerful recording of my grandchildren's voices that felt like a special kind of torture. I stopped leaving messages. My pleas were just echoes in an empty digital room. The memory of Sophie turning away from me in the school car park became my constant companion. It played in my head on a loop, each viewing a fresh stab of pain. I knew it was Mark's doing, his poison dripping into their ears. But knowing didn't make it hurt any less. I was a ghost, haunting the edges of a life that was no longer mine. A 67-year-old woman with nothing but memories and a dwindling pension. If you've ever hit a point so low you can't see a way up, you'll know the kind of dangerous peace that settles in. It's the peace of giving up. Then, on a Tuesday in late November, the letter arrived. It was nestled amongst the usual brown envelopes and takeaway menus pushed through my door. The envelope was thick, cream-colored card with the name of a London solicitor embossed in the corner. My hands trembled as I opened it. It was a formal summons to the reading of my daughter's will. The appointment was for the following week at their offices in Holborn. 6 months. It had taken 6 months. A cold dread washed over me. Why now? Most estates are settled within weeks. I remembered Mark complaining on the phone weeks ago, his voice sharp with frustration about delays and endless complications from the solicitor. I knew what this was. This was the final nail in the coffin. It was the formal, legal confirmation of my own erasure. Mark, as her husband, would inherit everything. The house, the savings, what little was left. And I would be there to witness it, a final public humiliation. For 2 days I considered not going. What was the point? To watch the man who made me homeless officially become the master of my daughter's legacy? But then a different thought, a harder, colder thought began to form. Claire would have wanted me there. She would have wanted me to bear witness. The day of the reading, I stood in front of the cracked mirror in my bedsit and prepared for battle. I had one good dress, a navy blue one I'd bought for a job interview I never got. I put on my mother's pearl earrings, their familiar weight a small comfort. I took the train into London, the city's relentless energy a jarring contrast to the hollowness inside me. The solicitor's office was in one of those imposing Georgian buildings, all polished brass and hushed carpets. It was a world away from the smell of stale beer and damp that clung to my coat. I pushed open the heavy oak door to the reception area, my heart a cold, tight knot in my chest. And there he was, Mark. He was sitting in a plush leather armchair as if he owned it, tapping impatiently on his phone. He wasn't dressed for mourning. He was in a sharp suit, a silk tie knotted perfectly at his throat. He had a leather briefcase resting by his feet. He looked like a man about to close a lucrative deal, a predator waiting for the kill. He looked up as I entered, and his face broke into that familiar, sickening smile. It was the smile of a man who believed he had already won. He thought I was there as a spectator to his triumph. He had no idea I was about to become the main event. He rose from his chair, a predator unfolding. That smile, the one he'd used to charm my daughter and fool our friends, was plastered across his face. It was an expensive, perfectly calibrated expression of sympathy that didn't reach his eyes. "Helen," he said, his voice oozing a theatrical concern that made my skin crawl. "How are you holding up? You look thin." I wanted to tell him that a diet of grief and value-brand soup tends to have that effect. Instead, I gave him a tight, bloodless smile of my own. "I'm managing, Mark," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. Not here, not ever again. A man in his 60s, with kind eyes that seemed entirely out of place in this environment, emerged from an inner office. This was Mr. Harrison, Claire's solicitor. He greeted us with a quiet professionalism that felt like a shield against the raw emotion in the room. He led us into his office. It was exactly as you'd imagine. Dark wood paneling, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and a desk large enough to land a helicopter on. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and money. Mark immediately claimed the chair with the best view of the city, leaning back like a king surveying his domain. Mr. Harrison began with the usual condolences, speaking of Claire with a genuine warmth that pricked at the back of my eyes. I gripped my handbag, the worn leather a small anchor in a sea of memory. I thought of my daughter's last coherent words to me in the hospice. "Look after my babies, Mum. Don't let them forget me." A promise that Mark had made impossible to keep. He opened a thick folder. "Claire's will is relatively straightforward," he began, and I watched Mark lean forward, pulling a ridiculously ostentatious fountain pen from his briefcase. What did you think of that little performance? A man bringing his own pen to a will reading as if he were about to sign a treaty. "As her husband," Mr. Harrison continued, his gaze neutral, "you, Mark, are the primary beneficiary of the house, the car, and her personal current account." A slow, triumphant smile spread across Mark's face. He actually made a little tick on a notepad. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. The solicitor went on, detailing the items left to the children. To my granddaughter Sophie, Claire had left her own grandmother's china and her jewelry to be held in trust until she was 18. To Dan, her collection of first-edition books and the piano he loved. A genuine smile touched my lips for the first time that day. My clever, thoughtful girl. She knew what would matter to them, the pieces of her they could hold on to as they grew. "And for you, Helen," Mr. Harrison said, looking directly at me. "Claire left all of her photo albums, her recipe collection, and a personal letter." A letter. My throat tightened. That was all I wanted. A final word from my child. Mark shifted impatiently in his chair, the sound of rustling leather filling the quiet room. He cleared his throat, his tone dripping with false sentiment. "That's all very touching," he said, "but can we move on to the more significant financial assets? The life insurance, her workplace pension, any investments?" Mr. Harrison's expression didn't flicker. Of course, Claire had a life insurance policy through her employer, valued at £150,000. I saw Mark's shoulders relax, the final piece of his victory slotting into place in his mind. "However," the solicitor added, the word hanging in the air like a guillotine. Mark's expensive pen stopped moving. His head snapped up. "A change?" he repeated, his voice suddenly sharp. "What kind of change? Have you ever watched a man's entire future unravel in a single second? It's a fascinating, terrible thing to behold." Mr. Harrison looked down at the document in front of him. The policy was, as you know, originally payable to you as her spouse. He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. "However, Claire amended the beneficiary. The full amount is now to be paid into a trust for her children, to be managed until Sophie is 25 and Daniel is 23. Silence. A thick, suffocating silence filled the room. The color drained from Mark's face, leaving a sickly, grayish pallor. His jaw worked, but no sound came out. £150,000? Gone. Vanished into a future he couldn't touch. He stared at Mr. Harrison, his eyes wide with disbelief and a dawning, volcanic rage. He thought the game was over. He had no idea it was just beginning. Mark finally found his voice. It was a strangled, furious whisper. "That's impossible. Claire would never. She was sedated. She wasn't thinking clearly. This has to be contested." Mr. Harrison didn't flinch. He simply met Mark's enraged gaze with a look of calm, unshakable authority. "I can assure you, Mr. Riley, that your wife was perfectly lucid when she made this amendment. In fact," he added, opening another folder, "she anticipated there might be questions about her state of mind. She recorded a video testimony with me to confirm her wishes." Video testimony. My brilliant girl. Even then, even as the life was draining out of her, she was 10 steps ahead of him. She had seen the monster, and she had built a fortress around her children from her hospital bed. A wave of fierce, heartbreaking pride washed over me. Mark sank back into his chair as if he'd been physically struck. The fight seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a sullen, resentful silence. I could see the calculations churning behind his eyes, the money he'd already spent in his head, the debts he was counting on that insurance to clear. He eventually managed a tight nod, forcing that hideous smile back onto his face. "Fine," he said. The word clipped. "The insurance goes to the children. I can live with that. But everything else, the house, the car, the accounts, that all comes to me. Correct?" "Yes," Mr. Harrison confirmed, "that is correct." The relief on Mark's face was palpable. He had the house. He could sell it, cash in, and start his new life. And that, I knew, was exactly what he planned to do. "That concludes the reading of Claire's will," the solicitor said, but he made no move to close the files on his desk. He looked from Mark's smug face to mine. "However, there is one additional matter to discuss." Mark was already halfway out of his seat, his briefcase in hand. "Additional matter?" he asked, his impatience barely concealed. He was done with me, done with my daughter's memory. He was ready to go and call the estate agent. "Yes," Mr. Harrison said, his gaze settling on me. There has been another death in the family, one that affects the disposition of a separate estate. A cold premonition trickled down my spine. I thought of my Aunt Eleanor, my father's sister. She'd been in a care home in Devon for years, a distant figure I hadn't spoken to in ages. "Mrs. Thompson," the solicitor said, his voice gentle, "I'm very sorry to inform you that your Aunt Eleanor Vance passed away 3 weeks ago." I felt a pang of sadness, muted by the sheer emotional exhaustion of the day. We'd exchanged Christmas cards, but little more. Mark had frozen, his hand on the doorknob. His predator's instinct had scented money. "Her solicitor contacted our firm," Mr. Harrison continued, speaking only to me now, "because you are named in her will as her sole beneficiary." The world tilted on its axis. Sole beneficiary? Eleanor was wealthy. Everyone in the family knew that, but she had no children, and I'd always assumed her fortune would go to a cat's home or some other charity. I barely knew her. "I don't understand," I whispered. Mark had turned back from the door, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning desperate greed. "How much are we talking about?" he demanded, the question directed at the solicitor, but his eyes were locked on me. Mr. Harrison opened the second, even thicker file. "Eleanor Vance's estate is considerable. After all taxes and fees, the total value is approximately £2.3 million. The silence in that room was absolute. It was so quiet I could hear the frantic, terrified thumping of Mark's heart from across the room. £2.3 million. The number was meaningless, an impossible string of zeros. Mark's face had gone from gray to a mottled, unhealthy purple. That money should be part of Claire's estate," he stammered, his voice cracking. "Family inheritance, it should flow through the marriage." "I'm afraid inheritance law doesn't work that way, Mr. Riley," Mr. Harrison said, and for the first time I detected a faint hint of satisfaction in his voice. He handed me a pale blue envelope. My name was written on the front in a spidery, familiar hand. Inside, a single sheet of paper. "My dear Helen," it read, "by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I know you're wondering why a batty old lady you barely knew has left you a fortune. The truth is, I saw your life through Claire's Christmas letters. I saw how you sacrificed everything for her. And I know that man threw you out of your own home with nothing but a broken heart. Consider this my way of evening the score. Go and show that worthless son-in-law what happens when you mess with one of our family." Tears streamed down my face as I read, tears of grief, of gratitude, of a terrible, righteous anger. I looked up at Mark. The smug confidence was gone. The fake sympathy was gone. All that was left was fear, pure, undiluted terror. He was looking at the powerless old woman he'd thrown out like rubbish, and he was finally seeing the person who now held his entire world in the palm of her hand. The transformation was immediate and grotesque. The fear in Mark's eyes curdled into a desperate, cloying charm. Have you ever seen a snake shed its skin? It was like that, a frantic sloughing off of one persona to reveal another, even slimier one beneath. Before I'd even folded Aunt Eleanor's letter, he was sliding his chair closer to mine, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial, syrupy tone. "Helen, it's incredible news," he purred, reaching for my hand as if we were dear old friends sharing a lottery win. I pulled my hand away. The touch of his skin felt like a contamination. Just 20 minutes ago, this man had been mentally calculating the commission on my daughter's house. Now he was acting as if my good fortune was a shared victory. "I'm still processing it, Mark," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. The shock was beginning to recede, replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. The universe had just handed me a weapon. I intended to learn how to use it. Of course, it's a lot to take in," he said, his smile so wide it looked painful. "But this is wonderful for the children, too. With your resources and with our resources combined, we can give them the world." Our resources. There it was. The pivot from me to we. He was already trying to merge my inheritance with his own desperate situation, weaving a narrative of family unity where just moments before there had been only contempt. Mr. Harrison, bless him, chose that moment to intervene. "Mrs. Thompson, you'll need to sign several documents. Perhaps we could schedule another appointment for early next week to go over the portfolio in detail." "Portfolio?" I asked, the word feeling alien on my tongue. "Eleanor owned property," he explained. "A seaside cottage in Devon, a flat in Kensington, and several rental properties in Bristol. Then there are the stocks and bonds." Mark was practically vibrating out of his suit. I could see the pound signs flashing in his eyes, a frantic calculation of assets and opportunities. He was already spending my money, redecorating my life. "Helen, you must come home with us tonight," he insisted, standing up and extending a hand to me, a gesture of magnanimous forgiveness for a crime he had committed. 6 months ago, I would have wept with relief. I would have believed that this money had somehow made me worthy of his love again. But 5 months of eating cold soup in a damp room teaches you to recognize a predator, even when it's disguised as a loving family man. "That's very kind, Mark," I said, remaining seated. "But I think I need some time alone." His smile flickered, the first crack in the facade. "Nonsense," he insisted. "This is exactly the sort of news that brings families together." I looked him straight in the eye. Funny how money does that, isn't it? The air in the room grew thick and cold. Mr. Harrison was watching us with the quiet, intense focus of a man watching a chess game reach its critical moment. "What do you mean by that?" Mark asked, his voice losing some of its honeyed charm. 6 months ago, I was a depressing reminder who had to be removed from your house," I said, quoting his own cruel words back at him. "Today, I'm family again. The only thing that's changed is my bank balance." His face cycled through a series of emotions: shock, indignation, and finally a mask of wounded innocence. "Helen, I think you misunderstood my position back then. We were all grieving. I've regretted asking you to leave from the moment you drove away." Have you ever had someone lie so boldly to your face that you almost admire the audacity? Tell me in the comments if you've ever experienced that moment of breathtaking dishonesty. I stood up, gathering my purse, my movements slow and deliberate. "Have you?" I asked. "Because when I called it Christmas to speak to Sophie and Dan, you told me they were too busy. When I sent birthday presents, they were returned to sender unopened. When I stood outside Dan's football match 3 months ago, you told the security guard I was harassing your family." Each fact was a stone, and I was building a wall between us he would never be able to climb. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently. He had dismissed these acts of cruelty as he had dismissed me. He never imagined they would one day be read out as charges against him. He followed me out to the lift, his desperation becoming more apparent with every step. "Helen, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "Don't leave like this. Claire wouldn't want this between us." The lift doors slid open. I stepped inside, turning to face him. "You want to know what Claire wanted, Mark?" I said, my voice as cold and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. "She wanted her children to know their grandmother. She wanted them to have a family. You taught them that love is conditional. You taught them that family can be thrown away when it becomes inconvenient. That's not fair, he protested, his hand shooting out to stop the doors. Neither was throwing a grieving widow out into the street, I replied, pressing the button for the ground floor. The last thing I saw before the doors slid shut was his face, pale, desperate, and finally understanding. The powerless woman he'd tried to erase was now the one person standing between him and utter ruin. The game had changed, and I was about to write the new rules.
The phone started ringing at 6 the next morning. It was a private number. I ignored it. It rang again at 6:15, and again at 6:30. By the fifth call, I was awake anyway, staring at the damp patch on my ceiling and letting the events of the previous day wash over me. I answered without checking the number. A small, hesitant voice whispered, "Grandma Helen." It was Sophie. My heart simultaneously broke and soared. 6 months of crushing silence, broken by a phone call orchestrated by a desperate man. "Hello, sweetheart," I said, my voice thick with unshed tears. "How are you?" Her reply was stilted, rehearsed. She told me her dad had said there'd been a misunderstanding and that he wanted to know if I could come for dinner, to talk, as a family. His fingerprints were all over her words. He was already using my granddaughter as a pawn, coaching her on how to reel me back in. He was filling her head with visions of a happy, reunited family now that Grandma could pay for it. What would you have done in my position? Would you have just caved for the sake of hearing your grandchild's voice? "I would love to see you, Sophie," I said carefully, choosing my words like a bomb disposal expert. "But your father and I have some things to sort out, privately." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, so quietly I almost missed it, she whispered, "I missed you at my birthday party. Dad said you were too busy to come." The lie was so cruel, so needlessly vicious, that it took my breath away. He hadn't just told me she didn't want me there. He told her I hadn't bothered to show up. He had deliberately broken her heart to keep us apart. "I wasn't busy, sweetheart," I said, my voice shaking with a cold, controlled fury. "I wasn't invited." The silence that followed was heavy with dawning understanding. I gave her a message for her father. "Tell him I'll consider dinner, but he meets me first, alone, at noon." I named a small Italian restaurant in town, a place called Giovanni's. I chose it deliberately. It was where he had taken Claire on their first date. I arrived early and chose a corner table, a quiet spot where a man couldn't cause a scene without making a fool of himself. He walked in 5 minutes later, and I had to bite back a bitter laugh. He'd had a haircut. He was wearing his best suit, a tie that screams trustworthy family man. He was dressed for a business negotiation, and that's exactly what this was. He leaned in to kiss my cheek, a gesture of such stunning hypocrisy that I flinched. He ordered an expensive bottle of wine and made small talk about the weather, his voice oozing a bonhomie that was utterly transparent. I let him chatter, watching him, studying him. I waited until our main courses had arrived. Then I put down my fork, folded my hands on the table, and looked him directly in the eye. "Tell me about the money you stole from Claire's retirement fund, Mark."
He physically choked on a piece of pasta. His face, which had been a healthy wine-flushed pink, turned a blotchy, terrified white. What are you talking about?" he spluttered, dabbing at his mouth with a napkin. "Let's not play games," I said, my voice low and even. "I know you were counting on that life insurance money. I know you were planning to use it to pay back the £60,000 you took from her pension without her knowledge." This was a complete bluff. I knew nothing for certain, but his reaction to the insurance news in the solicitor's office had planted a seed of suspicion. It was a wild guess, a shot in the dark, but it hit the bullseye with devastating accuracy. If you've ever had to gamble everything on a single gut instinct, you can share your story in the comments. The blood drained from his face. How could you possibly know that?" he whispered, his eyes darting around the restaurant as if looking for an escape route. "I had a chat with the pension administrators," I lied smoothly. "It seems they were very concerned about a series of unauthorized withdrawals made while Claire was in the hospice." He stared at his plate, the fight completely gone. He confessed everything. Bad investments, a business deal that went sour. He'd borrowed against her pension, always intending to pay it back, of course. He just needed a little more time. "I never wanted her to die," he said, his voice pathetic. "But when it became clear she wasn't going to recover, I had to be practical. Practical. While I was sleeping on a cot beside my daughter's bed, he was being practical. While I was selling my home to fund her last chance at life, he was stealing from her future to cover his past. So, when he kicked me out, it wasn't about grief. It was about needing to sell the house quickly to cover the £60,000 hole he'd blown in their finances. When he cut me off from the children, it was to stop me from finding out what he'd done. It was all about the money. It had always been about the money. I reached into my handbag and pulled out a manila envelope. Inside were printouts from public records, late mortgage payments, maxed out credit cards, a county court judgment for an unpaid loan. "You're not being practical, Mark," I said, sliding the envelope across the table. "You're drowning." I stood up, putting on my coat. "Dinner with my grandchildren tonight sounds lovely. Pick me up from my flat at 6. I left him there, sitting at the table, staring at the evidence of his own financial ruin. He was finally beginning to understand. The old woman he'd discarded now held his entire life in her hands. And the price of my silence was going to be very, very high.
Configuration. He picked me up at 6 on the dot, driving Claire's car. His own truck, he mumbled, was having gearbox trouble, a euphemism I now understood for not being able to afford the repair bill. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, the only sign of the terror churning beneath his carefully composed surface. The drive was 5 minutes of excruciating silence. He tried to fill it with pathetic pleasantries about the traffic, but the unspoken truth of our lunch meeting sat between us like a physical presence. He wasn't my son-in-law anymore. He was my prisoner, and we were both acutely aware of it. Walking through that front door was like stepping back in time. Nothing had changed. Claire's photos were still on the mantelpiece, her favorite reading glasses still folded on the side table next to her armchair. It wasn't a home anymore. It was a shrine, preserved not out of love, but because he was too broke to redecorate. Sophie appeared from the kitchen. She was taller than I remembered, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail just like her mother used to wear. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her eyes flicking from my face to her father's before she threw her arms around me. The hug was desperate, a silent scream of relief and confusion that told me everything I needed to know. Dan wandered in from the living room, now a lanky 15-year-old who seemed to be made entirely of arms and legs. He gave me an awkward, heartfelt hug. But as we stood there in the hallway, I saw it. I saw the way they both held themselves, a subtle tension in their shoulders, a quick, assessing glance towards their father before they spoke. Have you ever seen children who are walking on eggshells in their own home? It's a chilling sight. Over dinner, a pasta bake he'd clearly stressed over, Mark launched into his pre-rehearsed monologue. It was a nauseating performance about family values, the importance of forgiveness, and the beauty of second chances. Sophie and Dan listened politely, pushing food around their plates, their eyes saying nothing. Then he made his move. He set down his fork with a sense of dramatic finality. So, he began, beaming at the children, "I've been thinking about Grandma Helen's new situation, and I think it presents some wonderful opportunities for all of us." He spoke of university funds, of a family holiday to help us all heal, of home improvements. He was spinning my inheritance into a communal pot, a family asset that he, naturally, would help to manage. I watched him weave his web, and I saw my grandchildren looking at me, their expressions a mixture of hope and confusion. This was it. This was the moment. What would you have done? Would you have stayed silent to keep the fragile peace? Or would you have burned the whole rotten structure to the ground? I placed my knife and fork together on my plate. "Actually," I said, my voice cutting clearly through his speech, "I wanted to talk to you both about some changes." Mark's smile faltered. I turned to my grandchildren, ignoring him completely. "Do you remember when I lived here, before your mom passed away?" They both nodded, their faces brightening at the memory of baking and homework and Friday night films. "I want you to know," I said, my voice soft but clear, "that I didn't choose to leave this house. I was asked to leave, and I have been waiting every single day for 6 months for the chance to be in your lives again." Mark cleared his throat, a loud, panicked sound. "Helen, I think we agreed to move forward, not rehash old misunderstandings." "These weren't misunderstandings, Mark," I said, turning my gaze on him. It was cold enough to freeze water. "And the children deserve to know the truth." I looked back at Sophie, whose eyes were wide, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. "Your father told me that you and Dan needed space, that you didn't want to see me anymore," I said, gently. "And he told you that I was too busy to see you. Neither of those things was ever true." The silence that fell was absolute. I could see the pieces clicking together in Sophie's sharp, intelligent mind. She had her mother's intuition, and she was finally seeing the full, ugly picture of her father's manipulation. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her eyes locked on mine. "I mean I have been calling and texting every single day," I said, my voice gaining strength with every word of truth. "I mean I sent you birthday presents that were returned unopened. I mean I came to your school, your games, only to be told I was unwelcome. For 6 months I have been living in a tiny, miserable flat, missing you both so much it felt like a physical ache, and wondering why on earth you had stopped loving me." "We never stopped loving you," Dan said, his voice cracking. "Dad said, he said you needed space, and that you'd call when you were ready." The final lie was exposed, lying bare and ugly on the dinner table between us. I watched Sophie's face. The confusion was gone, replaced by a look of such cold, clear fury that it reminded me so much of her mother. She turned to her father. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a judge's sentence. "Dad," she said, "is that true?" Configuration. Mark was trapped. The web of lies he'd so carefully woven over 6 months had been torn apart in 60 seconds, and he was caught in the wreckage. He looked at his daughter, at the unwavering steel in her gaze, and I saw the panic flicker in his eyes. He tried to bluster his way out, falling back on the tired language of a man who refuses to take responsibility. He spoke of adult complications and protecting them from disagreements. It was pathetic, a desperate attempt to reframe deliberate cruelty as a misguided act of paternal care.
Sophie wasn't having any of it. She stood up from the table, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. "I need some air," she said, her voice tight with suppressed rage, and walked out onto the back patio. Dan, ever her shadow, followed a moment later, leaving me alone in the wreckage with the man who had caused it. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice low and venomous. The charming facade was gone, replaced by the raw, petulant anger of a cornered animal. "Yes," I replied, my voice equally quiet. "Those children have been living in a world you built from lies. They deserved to be set free." He looked at me then, a new kind of fear dawning in his eyes. The fear of a man who has lost control of the narrative. "You've turned them against me," he whispered. "What's your endgame here, Helen? What do you want?" I looked around the kitchen, at the memories of a life that felt a million miles away. My endgame was simple. I want to make sure Sophie and Dan have the stability and security their mother wanted for them, with or without you. Through the patio doors, I could see them, two silhouettes in the fading light, their heads close together. They were talking, processing, and making a decision. Their decision. For the first time in 6 months, they were free to have their own thoughts, their own feelings, without their father's poisonous filter. I left him sitting at the table and went outside. Sophie had been crying, but they were angry tears, not sad ones. Dan had his arm around her, a gesture of quiet solidarity that was so like his mother it made my heart ache. "Is Dad in financial trouble?" Sophie asked, her voice devoid of any emotion. She had bypassed the hurt and gone straight to the cold, hard logic of the situation. I told them the truth, carefully but without softening the edges. I told them about the money he'd borrowed from their mother's pension. Sophie's face went very still. "So, he stole from Mum while she was dying?" she said. It wasn't a question. "And then he kicked you out because he was afraid you'd find out? And now he wants to be your best friend because you have money?" She saw it all, with the brutal clarity of a 16-year-old who has just had her world turned upside down. She understood that her father's sudden affection was transactional. It was about his survival, not their well-being. "We want to live with you," Dan said quietly, looking up at me. "We want to stay in our school, see our friends. We want to be with someone who actually wants us around." The words were a balm to my wounded soul. But this wasn't how I wanted it. Not a victory born from my grandchildren's pain. Mark still had legal custody, a fact I gently pointed out. Sophie's laugh was cold and humorless. "He won't fight it," she said, with chilling certainty. Have you ever seen a child forced to become a warrior to protect themselves? It is a terrible and magnificent thing. Just then, the patio door slid open. Mark stepped outside, his face a carefully constructed mask of concern. "How's everyone doing?" he asked, with a forced cheerfulness that was almost comical. Sophie stood up and faced him. "We want to live with Grandma Helen," she said, her voice as flat and final as a closing door. He tried to reason with her, to dismiss it as an emotional outburst, but the time for his manipulations was over. "Our family structure is already broken, Dad," she told him, her voice unwavering. "You broke it. You broke it when you lied to us, when you stole from Mum, and when you threw away the only person who actually wanted to take care of us." He looked at me, his eyes pleading. "Helen, tell them this isn't a good idea. Tell them families should stay together." I looked at this man, this hollowed-out shell of pride and desperation, and then at my grandchildren, their faces set and resolute. "Families should stay together," I agreed softly. But first, they have to be built on a foundation of trust. And you, Mark, have burned that foundation to the ground." He stared at his daughter, finally seeing not a child he could control, but a woman he had wronged. What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. And that was it. That was the moment of his complete and utter surrender. Sophie looked at me, a silent question in her eyes. It was time to set the terms. The negotiation took place at the kitchen table, a grim parody of 1,000 family meals. Mark sat opposite his children, a defendant awaiting sentencing. I took the seat at the head of the table, not as a judge, but as an advocate for the 2 young lives he had so carelessly damaged. Sophie, my fiercely organized, brilliant girl, had already prepared. She pulled out a piece of paper from her pocket, a list of demands written in her neat, determined handwriting. It was a declaration of independence. "First," she began, her voice steady, "no more lies, about anything. The money, grandma, why you do the things you do. We want the truth or we want nothing." Mark gave a reluctant, jerky nod. "Second, we're staying in this house and at our school. No moving to Florida or anywhere else. This is our home." Mark opened his mouth to protest, probably to mention the mortgage payments he couldn't make, but Dan cut him off. "That can be sorted," he said, with a quiet authority that startled me. My grandson was learning the language of leverage. "Third," Sophie continued, her eyes boring into her father's, "you get help, proper counseling. We need to know you understand why what you did was so wrong." This was the point he balked at, the suggestion that he, the parent, needed fixing. But Sophie was relentless. "What you've been doing isn't working, Dad," she said, her voice softening slightly, a flicker of the daughter who still loved him. "It's breaking all of us." He finally caved, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "And if I agree to all of this?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. Sophie looked at me then, a silent handover. It was my turn. "If you agree," I said, my voice calm and measured, "then we all work together to build something new. That will mean financial support from me to keep this house for the children. It will mean shared custody and family counseling for all of us to repair the damage." "And if I don't agree?" he asked, the last flicker of defiance in his eyes. "Then Sophie and Dan move in with me tonight," I said, my voice dropping to a steely whisper. "You can deal with your financial ruin alone, and we let a court decide what's best for these children with a full and frank disclosure of your recent financial activities." The threat, unspoken but crystal clear, hung in the air between us. I had him. We all knew it. His final condition of surrender was to ask about the £60,000. If he paid it back, he asked, would that fix things? "It's a start, Dad," Sophie said, "but trust isn't about money. It's about admitting you were wrong." He finally broke then, a dry, ragged sob escaping his lips. He admitted he'd been too proud to ask for help. He admitted he'd made bad choices. And then Sophie delivered the final terms. "We'll give you 6 months," she declared. 6 months to prove you can be the dad we need. And for those 6 months, we're living with Grandma. The children moved into my tiny, grim bedsit that weekend. It was absurd trying to fit 2 growing teenagers into a space barely big enough for one grieving widow. But it was also glorious. The silence was filled with their music, their laughter, their arguments over the remote control. Our first order of business was to find a new home. Not just a place to live, but a sanctuary, a place where we could begin to heal. We found it on a quiet, tree-lined street called Maple Avenue, a lovely 1920s semi with a wraparound porch that Claire would have adored. As we stood in the sunlit living room, Sophie turned to me, her expression serious. She had been thinking. "Grandma," she said, "I think we should pay off all of Dad's debts." I was stunned. After everything he'd done, she was suggesting an act of incredible generosity. "Why, sweetheart?" I asked. Her answer took my breath away with its wisdom. "Because right now, he can always blame his bad behavior on being stressed about money. If we take that away, if we give him a completely clean slate, then he has no more excuses. Then we'll see who he really is." It was an audacious, terrifying, and brilliant plan. A final, high-stakes test of her father's character. We were going to buy his redemption. And if he failed, we would know, once and for all, that he was truly a lost cause. The meeting with my new financial advisor, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Mrs. Patterson, laid bare the full extent of Mark's disaster. It was worse than I'd imagined. The £60,000 from Claire's pension was just the tip of the iceberg. He was drowning in nearly £90,000 of additional debt, credit cards, car loans, back taxes on the house. He hadn't just been robbing my daughter's future, he'd been systematically dismantling their present. Sophie, who had insisted on being at the meeting, listened to the grim litany without flinching. Her generation, I've noticed, has a far more brutal understanding of money than mine ever did. They've grown up in a world of debt and financial precarity. When Mrs. Patterson finished, Sophie simply looked at me, her gaze steady. "So, £150,000 in total," she said, her voice calm, "to wipe it all clean." It was a staggering sum, enough to buy a small house in some parts of the country. "Are you sure about this, sweetheart?" I asked, giving her one last chance to reconsider. "It's your money, your inheritance from Aunt Eleanor." She nodded, her expression resolute. "It's not for him," she said, a phrase that was becoming her mantra. "It's for us. It's for clarity." It was the most cold-blooded act of compassion I had ever witnessed. We were funding his recovery, but on our terms, for our reasons. I had the bank draw up the cashier's checks, one for the pension fund, the rest for his various creditors. I arranged for him to meet me at the new house on Maple Avenue. I wanted him to see what a life built on honesty and stability looked like. He arrived looking thin and haunted, a man being eaten from the inside out by shame. I made him tea in my new sunlit kitchen while Sophie and Dan waited in the living room. This was a transaction, not a reconciliation. I laid the checks out on the table in front of him, a fan of crisp, cream-colored paper that represented the sum of his failures. He stared at them as if they were venomous. "I don't understand," he whispered, his hands trembling. "I'm not doing this for you, Mark," I told him, my voice devoid of sympathy. "I'm doing it for my grandchildren. They deserve to know if the man they call Dad is a decent person who made bad choices under pressure, or if he's just fundamentally broken." Sophie appeared in the doorway then, a silent, watchful presence. "The slate is clean now, Dad," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the force of a final judgment. "No more excuses, no more desperate circumstances. From now on, every choice you make is a choice about what kind of man you want to be." He picked up the checks, his hands shaking so badly I thought he might drop them. "This is too much," he stammered. "I can't accept this." "You're not accepting it," Dan said, joining his sister in the doorway. "It's an investment in our future." You just happen to be the project. The simple, brutal honesty of a 15-year-old. What do you think of that line? Let me know in the comments. Mark looked from his son to his daughter, and I saw a flicker of something new in his eyes. Not just shame, but a dawning understanding of the grace he was being offered. He finally nodded, a gesture of complete and utter surrender. "What happens if I take this money?" he asked, his voice cracking. "And I still mess it up?" Sophie and I had discussed this. We had a plan. "Then you keep the money," she said, her voice unwavering. "But we're done. This is your last chance to prove you're worth the effort." The terms were laid bare. We were betting £150,000 on the slim possibility of his redemption. He left with the checks and a new, crushing weight on his shoulders, the weight of a final chance. As we watched him walk down the path, Sophie turned to me. "Do you think he'll change?" she asked. "I don't know, sweetheart," I said, putting my arm around her. "But now we get to find out." For the first few months, the change in Mark was almost imperceptible. It was less about grand gestures and more about the quiet accumulation of small, honest moments. He started therapy, a fact he admitted with a kind of grudging embarrassment. He enrolled in a financial management course at the local college, learning how to budget and save like a man who had finally understood the value of a pound. He called the children every day, not with demands or manipulative questions, but with simple, mundane updates about his life. He told them about the leaky tap he'd fixed in his new, rented flat. He told them about the stray cat he'd started feeding. He was learning to communicate without an agenda, a skill he had never before possessed. Sophie and Dan were cautious, their trust fragile and hard-won. They would report these conversations to me with a kind of detached curiosity, like scientists observing a strange specimen. Was he performing? Was this just another, more sophisticated act? We didn't know. The real test came on a cold, gray afternoon in March. I was at the supermarket when my phone rang. It was Dan, his voice tight with pain and a desperate attempt not to cry. "Grandma," he gasped, "I think I've broken my wrist at football practice." My blood ran cold. "Where's your father?" I asked, my voice sharp with adrenaline. "I tried calling," he said, his voice cracking. "He's on a building site. He's not answering his phone." "I'm on my way," I said, abandoning my trolley in the middle of the aisle. 20 minutes later, I was in the A&E department of the local hospital, holding my grandson's good hand while a harassed-looking doctor confirmed the diagnosis. It was a bad break, a complex fracture that would require surgery. Dan was trying to be brave, but I could see the fear in his eyes. This was his right arm, his throwing arm. He was the star quarterback of his school's American football team, and his entire future, his hopes of a university scholarship, were tied to the strength and precision of that limb. Just as the doctor was explaining the surgical procedure, Mark burst through the doors of the waiting room. He was still in his work clothes, splattered with mud and dust, his face pale with panic. "Where is he?" he demanded, his eyes scanning the room frantically. The look of pure, unadulterated relief on Dan's face when he saw his father was a physical blow. In that moment, I understood how much my grandchildren had missed the simple, foundational security of a parent who shows up, a parent you can count on in a crisis. "Hey, Dad," Dan said, a weak smile touching his lips. "Bit of a mess, eh?" Mark sank into the chair on the other side of the bed, his fear giving way to a wave of guilt. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "My phone was in the lorry. I didn't hear it." "Dad, it's okay," Dan interrupted, his voice gentle. But Mark was shaking his head, not just apologizing for the missed calls, but for the 6 months of silence, for every time he hadn't been there when they needed him. The surgery was scheduled for the next morning. Someone needed to stay with Dan overnight for observation. Before I could even volunteer, Mark looked at me, his expression a mixture of determination and a plea for permission. "I'll stay," he said, "but I might need your help tomorrow with the aftercare." 6 months ago, he would have blustered, pretended he could handle it all himself. He would have seen asking for help as a sign of weakness. Now, he was admitting his limitations before they became a problem. It was a small thing, but it was everything. The surgery was a success, but the recovery was grueling. Mark was magnificent. He managed the complex schedule of pain medication, helped Dan with the awkward logistics of showering and dressing, and, most importantly, he was firm. He enforced the doctor's strict orders, even when Dan, frustrated and bored, wanted to push the boundaries. He became a parent, not a performer, not a financial manager, but a father. He and I became a team, a strange, unlikely partnership forged in the sterile corridors of the hospital. We were no longer adversaries. We were simply two people who loved the same child. The turning point came 6 weeks later at a follow-up appointment. The consultant studied the x-rays, a small smile playing on his lips. "The bone is healing beautifully," he announced. "If you work hard at the physiotherapy, you could be back on the pitch by the start of next season." Dan's face broke into a grin of pure, unadulterated joy. That night, Mark called a family meeting in our kitchen at Maple Avenue. He stood nervously by the counter, wringing his hands, a man about to make the most important speech of his life. He told us he'd been thinking about the 6-month arrangement. He said he finally understood that real change wasn't a temporary performance. It was about accepting that he would always be flawed and that he couldn't be a father on his own anymore. "I don't want to go back to the way things were," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I want us to keep being a family the way we are now, with your grandmother not as a backup, but as a partner, with all of our voices mattering." He was proposing a new kind of family, one built not on legal ties or old obligations, but on a new, hard-won foundation of honesty and mutual respect. He was abdicating his role as the sole patriarch and asking to be an equal member of the team. The 6-month trial was almost over, and now the final verdict rested with his children. The kitchen was silent. Sophie and Dan exchanged a look, a swift, unreadable communication that had been forged in the crucible of their shared grief and betrayal. The 6-month deadline was still 2 weeks away, but the final exam was happening right now, at this table. "Does that mean you want us to keep living with Grandma?" Dan asked, his voice careful. He was testing the sincerity of his father's surrender. Was this another manipulation, a way to get them back under his roof? Mark's answer was immediate and unequivocal. "I want you to live wherever you feel safest and happiest," he said, his gaze steady and clear. "If that's here with your grandmother, then that's what I want too. She's not going to disappear from our lives again, ever." It was the right answer. It was the only answer. He was finally putting their needs before his own ego. He was ceding control not because he had to, but because he understood it was the right thing to do. Sophie, who had been watching her father with an unnerving stillness, finally spoke. "I think," she said slowly, choosing her words with the precision of a surgeon, "that we're all different people than we were 6 months ago. Maybe we need to figure out what our family looks like now, instead of trying to go back to what it used to be." What a profound statement from a 17-year-old. She had understood the fundamental truth that we all had to learn. You can't unbreak something and pretend the cracks aren't there. You have to build something new, something stronger, that incorporates the scars. "What does that mean?" Mark asked, his voice laced with a nervous hope. It was Dan who answered, his voice gaining a new confidence I hadn't heard before. "It means we don't go back to the old way, but we don't stay exactly like this either. We figure out something new, together." I looked at the three of them, these people who had been shattered by lies and loss, and who were now tentatively, bravely trying to piece themselves back together. My heart, which had felt like a cold, hard stone, began to thaw. "Whatever we decide," I said, my voice joining the conversation as an equal partner, "we decide together. No more secrets, no more unilateral decisions, no more throwing people away." Mark's eyes filled with tears, not the performative, self-pitying tears I had seen before, but the quiet, cleansing tears of a man who has finally understood the depth of the damage he has caused. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words raw and unadorned. "We know, Dad," Sophie said gently, her voice full of a grace he did not deserve, but which she offered anyway. "And we forgive you, but don't mess this up again. This is it. This is your last chance." "I won't," he promised, and for the first time in a very long time, I believed him. And so we began to build our new family. It was an unconventional, patchwork creation, but it was ours. Mark moved into the small flat above the kebab shop that had once been my prison. He insisted on it, a strange act of penance, I suppose. It was close enough for him to be a constant, reliable presence in the children's lives, but far enough away that we all had our own space. The children split their time, moving between the two homes with an easy fluidity. We established new traditions. Sunday lunches at my house, where Mark would help me cook. Friday night film nights at his flat, where I would join them. We were a team, a strange four-person parenting unit navigating the complexities of our new reality. We learned to talk, really talk. We had family meetings where we discussed everything from university applications to whose turn it was to take out the bins. There were no more secrets, no more unspoken resentments. 1 year after that fateful day in the solicitor's office, I stood in the kitchen of my house on Maple Avenue, a house bought with the money that was meant to be an act of revenge, but had instead become an instrument of healing. Mark was teaching Dan how to make Claire's famous chocolate chip cookies, a recipe I had taught him the week before. Sophie was sprawled on the living room floor, surrounded by university prospectuses. Her future, which had once seemed so precarious, was now a vast landscape of possibility. The phone rang. It was Mr. Harrison, the solicitor. He had some interesting news. It seemed my Aunt Eleanor, in her infinite wisdom, had also established a charitable foundation years ago. The foundation provided financial support to 2 specific groups of people: families facing financial ruin due to medical bills, and elderly people who had been victims of financial abuse by their own families. And they were looking for a new member for their board of directors. They were specifically interested in me. I nearly dropped the phone. A position on the board? Me? I was a retired bookkeeper who, until a year ago, had been living on tinned soup and a state pension. What could I possibly offer a prestigious charitable foundation? Mr. Harrison explained. They weren't interested in my financial acumen. They were interested in my experience. They wanted someone who understood, from the inside, the quiet desperation of a family bankrupted by illness. They wanted someone who knew the sting of being discarded and exploited by those who should have protected them. I looked around my kitchen, at Mark patiently showing Dan how to brown the butter for the cookies, a small domestic act of redemption, at Sophie dreaming of a future she was now free to choose, at the life we had so painstakingly rebuilt from the ashes of betrayal. Aunt Eleanor's letter had told me to use her money to even the score. I had thought that meant revenge, but what if she meant something more? What if she meant rebalancing the scales, not just for me, but for others like me? I told my family the news after I hung up. Sophie looked up from her paperwork, a slow, brilliant smile spreading across her face. "Grandma, that's perfect for you," she said immediately. "You could help so many people." "It would mean traveling," I said, a little hesitantly. "Board meetings, events." Mark didn't miss a beat. "We can handle it," he said, his voice firm and confident. "We're a team. We've got each other's backs." A year ago, the thought of leaving the children in his care would have been unthinkable. Now it felt right. It was another step in the slow, careful dance of rebuilding trust. That evening, we had dinner on the front porch, a new tradition we'd started. The autumn air was crisp, and the conversation flowed easily, a comfortable murmur of university plans, football seasons, and the possibilities of my new role. Then, as we were finishing dessert, Sophie made an announcement. "I have some news," she said, her voice a little shaky. "I heard from Northwestern yesterday. They've offered me a place, early admission with a partial scholarship." The celebration was immediate and joyous. It was Claire's old university, the place she had always dreamed her brilliant daughter would go. I was already mentally calculating tuition fees and accommodation costs, my heart swelling with pride. But Sophie held up a hand, silencing our cheers. "There's just one thing," she said, her expression serious. "I'm not sure I want to go." The silence that followed was thick with confusion. This was everything she'd been working for. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Mark asked, his voice gentle. "I mean," she said, looking around at the three of us, her family, her team, Northwestern was Mom's dream for me. It wasn't necessarily my dream for myself. And after everything we've been through this year, I'm not sure I want to be an 8-hour flight away from you all." The maturity of that statement, the sheer emotional intelligence of it, took my breath away. She was choosing connection over prestige, family over ambition. She had learned a lesson that takes most people a lifetime to understand, that success is meaningless without people to share it with. "Your mother wanted you to be happy, Sophie," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "She wanted you to have choices. If Northwestern isn't the right choice for you now, then that's okay." A slow, secret smile spread across her face. "Actually," she said, "there is somewhere else. The University of Chicago. They've offered me a full scholarship to study social work." She paused, letting the words sink in. "They have a special program," she continued, her voice gaining a new, passionate energy. "It focuses on family crisis intervention and financial counseling for families dealing with medical debt." She had taken the worst year of our lives, the trauma that had almost destroyed us, and she had turned it into a calling. She was going to use our pain to help heal others. She was going to take Aunt Eleanor's gift of justice and make it her life's work. My brilliant, resilient, magnificent girl. She hadn't just survived, she had transformed. The silence that followed Sophie's announcement wasn't confusion. It was awe. We were all looking at this young woman who had walked through fire and emerged not burned, but forged. She had found a way to honor her mother's memory that was more profound than simply following in her academic footsteps. "That's perfect," Dan said, his voice quiet with admiration. "Mom would be so proud." Mark, his eyes shining with unshed tears, reached across the table and squeezed his daughter's hand. "We're all proud," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "You're going to change lives, Soph. I know it." As we sat there in the gathering twilight, I felt Claire's presence so keenly it was almost a physical warmth. She had worried so much in those final months, terrified she was leaving her children without the tools they needed to navigate the world. But somehow, through the wreckage, they had learned the most important lessons of all. They had learned that family isn't an obligation, it's a choice you make every single day. They had learned that integrity matters more than convenience. And they had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do with your own pain is use it to heal someone else's. I thought of the woman I was a year ago, a ghost in a damp bedsit, convinced my life was over. I thought of the rage and the thirst for revenge that had consumed me. Aunt Eleanor had given me the money to even the score, and I had. But the final victory wasn't seeing Mark collapse in a solicitor's office. It was this. It was sitting on the porch of a house bought with her gift, surrounded by a family that had been broken and then rebuilt, stronger and more honest than before. It was watching my granddaughter choose a future of service, and my grandson learn that strength and vulnerability can coexist. It was seeing a man who had caused so much pain finally learn the quiet, difficult work of redemption. I raised my coffee cup. To Aunt Eleanor, I said, who believed in rebalancing the scales. To Mum, Sophie added, her voice clear and strong, who protected us even when she couldn't stay to raise us. To second chances, Mark said quietly, his eyes meeting mine across the table. To family, Dan concluded, smiling at us all. We sat there for a long time as the stars began to appear in the deep blue sky. We didn't need to talk. We were simply present, together, in the quiet peace that we had earned. The next week, I formally accepted the position on the board of the foundation. My first act was to help approve a grant for a family in Manchester whose daughter was battling a rare form of leukemia, the same kind that had taken Claire. We paid off their mortgage and funded their travel. It wasn't revenge. It was a restoration. It was a quiet, determined refusal to let the darkness win. Have you ever found a purpose in your own pain? A way to turn your deepest wounds into a source of strength for others? It's a strange and powerful kind of alchemy. Mark was wrong that day, all those months ago. He told me to enjoy being homeless. He didn't understand. A home isn't just bricks and mortar. It's the people you choose to build your life with. I never enjoyed being homeless, but I am, finally, enjoying being home. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever had to fight your way back from the brink, if you've ever had to rebuild your life from the ashes, I see you. Your story matters.